Okay, so we have seen Lagrange's theorem and we have also defined the index of a subgroup in a group. Now, if you recall, we have used this equivalence relation and then we carried out some arguments which ultimately led us to the statement of Lagrange's theorem. Now we look at the same proof but without using this relation. We are going to in fact look at what is going on behind this relation from just using elements of the group and the subgroup. So an alternate way of looking at the proof of Lagrange's theorem. Now I am not going to write things formally, we will just see what's going on. So as usual, G is a finite group and H is a subgroup of G. So H is also finite and that means we can list its elements, say H1, H2 up to Hn. One of these elements is the identity element because H is a subgroup. Which one we don't know and we don't care. Which one is the identity element, that serves no purpose in what we are going to see now. Okay. Now watch this. If it happens that H is equal to G, then of course there is nothing to see. The order of H divides the order of G because they are the same. So that means we have to look at the case where H is not equal to G. H is a proper subset of G. Then we can choose an element A in G minus H, an element of G which is not in H. Now what we do, we look at the elements of this right coset HA. By definition, the elements will be this H2A, etc., HNA. Now the first thing we are going to observe is that these elements are all distinct. Why? Because you see, if some HIA is equal to some HJA, then using the right cancellation law, we will then have HI equal to HJ, and because the elements, the H's here are all distinct, so this implies I has to be equal to J. So two different elements here cannot be equal. That means just like we have n elements here, we must have n elements here also. Okay, so that is one thing. The other observation is that none of these elements can appear inside H. Say otherwise what will happen, suppose HIA appears inside H means it should be some, say, HJ. Okay, then multiplying both sides by HI inverse from the left gives us A equal to Hi inverse Hj, but Hi and Hj are elements in H, so this element will belong to H because H is a subgroup, but this itself is a contradiction. It contradicts our choice of A, that A is not in H, but this one says that A is in H. So this cannot happen. None of these elements can appear here. So apart from these n elements, we have got n more elements in the group. They of course they all have to be in the group because everything is happening in the group and the group is closed with respect to the operations. Now if it happens that G is equal to H union HA, that is the elements of H along with the newly formed elements exhaust all of G, then order of G is, how many elements does n have? I mean H have? N, plus how many elements here? HA, n. So this is 2n, or 2 times order of H. In this case also we have the fact that order of H divides order of G. Suppose this is not true, G is not equal to this union, then we can choose an element B in G which is neither in H nor in HA. That means it's in the complement of their union. Now we continue the procedure with B. We look at the elements of this right coset HB, H1B, H2B, like that up to HNB. Now because of the similarity of the situation, we already know that these elements are going to be distinct. Also, none of these elements will appear in H. However, it may be that some element here has already appeared here, not in H but in HA. What happens if you have something like that? Say HIB is equal to HJA for some I and j lying between 1 and n. If that happens, then B can be written like this: HI inverse HJA. Now we can keep HI inverse and HJ together by associative law. This part is in H and this is A. So by the definition of the right coset HA, this belongs to HA. This is again a contradiction because according to our choice, B is not in HA, but this one is saying B is in HA. So this supposition is wrong. That is, no element in this list can appear here. So we have got n more elements, right? Now it may happen that G is equal to H union HA union HB, or it may not happen. If this happens, then definitely just like how we calculated this one, we would get order of G equal to 3 times order of H, and Lagrange's theorem is true. Otherwise we would take yet another element in the complement of this union in G and continue the procedure. But the point is that since G is finite, all these new elements will ultimately exhaust G. But if we ever get a new element which is not in the lists that we have created, then that new element will create n more new elements. So by the time you finish the process, you will always have a multiple of the order of h elements. So that's why, and that's how Lagrange's theorem is true. The introduction of this equivalence relation actually hides all these calculations and considerations behind itself. Okay, it does the job for us. It creates the equivalence classes which turn out to be the right cosets. So all these considerations need not be seen in detail if this thing is used. However, behind it all these things are going on because of this, and you can see that it's not that difficult also. So that is another interpretation of the proof of Lagrange's theorem. Okay, now it should be mentioned that the converse to Lagrange's theorem is false if G is a finite group and M is a positive divisor of order of G, then G does not necessarily have a subgroup of order M. That there is no guarantee that such a subgroup will exist. There exists, and there are counterexamples, of course, of the fact that this converse is not true. There exists a group of order 12 which has no subgroup of order 6, although 6 divides 12. However, towards the end of group theory in this book, we will see a sort of partial converse. I mean, if you take any M, then it's not necessary that G has a subgroup of order M. However, if you take special types of M, then there exists some subgroups. We will see that in Syllo's theorem. Okay. Now, Lagrange's theorem is very important. We have already said that simply because it puts restriction on the subgroups that a finite group can have, some sort of restriction, and which is actually very stringent restriction. For example, if you say have a group of order 7, then by Lagrange's theorem, such a group cannot have a subgroup whose order is say 2 or 3, 4, 5, because none of them divides 7. So automatically all the possibility of having many subgroups is automatically ruled out because this number is prime. And note that there may be, who knows how many different types of groups may be there. of order 7, but the fact that what type of subgroups should exist in such a group depends only on the number and not the nature of the group. That is the magical thing. Okay, now we are going to look at some of the corollaries of Lagrange's theorem. The corollaries themselves are very important results. Now, but before we go to that, we see a definition. Let G be a group and A be an element in G. We say that A is of order M, or A has order M if M is the least positive integer for which this integral power is equal to E. So, if for this element in the group there exists a positive integer m such that a to the power m is equal to E, and m is the least such positive integer, then m is said to be the order of A, or A is said to be of order m or has order n. But it may not exist also if no such m exists. Then we say that A is of infinite order. And this order actually is also called period. I may add it here, order m, has order m, or period m. Order is more popular, but it is also called period. We denote the order of A by O of A. Okay, and especially when this is a finite positive integer. If it is infinite, then of course we don't use this. Now note one thing, that if G is a group, okay, I may as well write that. Note that if G is any group, then the identity element to the power 1 is equal to identity, and as such order of the identity element is 1. This is true in any group. It does not depend on the nature of the group. The identity element always has order 1, and something more is also true. The identity element is the only element of order 1. Also, if A belongs to G, such that order of A is equal to 1, then by definition what we will have then, A to the power 1 is equal to identity, but we already know from our definition of integral powers of elements in a group that A to the power 1 is nothing but A. So A is equal to identity. So the only element of order 1 is the identity. In any group, is the identity. This also tells us that if we take a non-identity element, then either it is of infinite order or its order is a positive integer greater than 1. Okay, so now we come to the first corollary. Corollary 1. If G is a finite group and A belongs to G, then order of A divides order of G. So if in a finite group we have an element, then its order has to divide order of G. Now at first glance one may miss this point, that although we are given G is finite, but nothing is immediately telling me that the order of the element also has to be finite. So this the thing that we have to prove here has two parts actually. One of them is making sure that this order of A is finite, and the second, of course, we have to prove that it divides the order of G. Okay, so let us see the proof. Consider the elements A square, A cube, etc. All the positive integral powers of A. These elements all belong to G because G is closed. Since G is finite, there must be repetition in the list. Because all the elements are in G and G is finite, all of them cannot be distinct. There must be repetition. After some stage there must be repetition. That is, there should be integers I and j such that positive integers, that's why we are writing 1 less than or equal to I less than j. So we have already written such that this and a to the power I should be equal to a to the power j. Okay, this implies a to the power j minus I is equal to identity. You multiply both sides by a to the power minus I and use the rules of exponent, you get this. Since j minus I, now look at this inequality, I is less than j, so j minus I is a positive integer. Since j minus I is a positive integer, order of A is finite. Why? Because you see, we have already obtained a positive integer for which this equation is true. So the order of A is the least such positive integer. So that means that will be finite, that will be less than or equal to j minus I. So we have proved that order of A is finite. Okay, now consider the cyclic subgroup generated by A. We have already got this in one of the examples. We considered the cyclic subgroup generated by A. It's a subgroup of G that we already know. Okay. Now our aim is to prove that the order of this cyclic subgroup is nothing but the order of A. Note that E, A square, etc., a to the power order of A minus 1, all of these things belong to the cyclic subgroup generated by A, simply because they are integral powers of A, and that too they are non-negative integral powers of A. This one is also an integral power of A because this is A to the power 0 and this is A to the power 1. This one is A to the power order of A minus 1. Since order of A is a positive integer, so order of A minus 1 is a non-negative integer. Okay, so these are non-negative integral powers of A. All of them belong to A. Okay. If there exist integers, say n and m, such that order of a minus 1 and a to the power n is equal to a to the power m. In other words, if two symbols here are equal, one of them is a to the power n, you see these integers are the exponents appearing here. They are all non-negative and they are less than or equal to this maximum value. So if two of them are equal, then so here the argument we are carrying out is somewhat like what we have here. Then a to the power, since n is less than m, we have this, but m minus n is a positive integer and m minus n is positive because n is less than m, and this is less than or equal to m because n is non-negative. We are subtracting a non-negative integer from this, so its value will be less than or equal to m. So which m itself is less than or equal to order of a minus 1, which is strictly less than order of a. So we have obtained a positive integer for which this equation is true, but m minus n is less than order of a, and this contradicts the minimality of order of a, because by definition order of a is the smallest positive integer, which when you place here in the exponent the equation should be true. But here we have got an even smaller positive integer. This contradicts the minimality of order of a. Okay, so that means our supposition here is wrong. So we cannot have such integers n and m, that is the elements, these elements are all distinct and these are distinct elements in the cyclic subgroup generated by A. Okay, now we want to prove that they are not just distinct elements in this subgroup, but they are the only elements in this subgroup. Let K be any integer so that a to the power k is an arbitrary element of this cyclic subgroup, because according to the definition of a cyclic subgroup, the elements in the subgroup are integral powers of a, and the integer appearing in the exponent can be any integer. Now by the Euclidean algorithm, ordinary Euclidean algorithm in the ring of integers. There exist integers s and r such that k is equal to s times order of a plus r, where r is an integer which is non-negative and strictly less than order of a. In other words, here we are dividing k